All right, today we're going to talk about the Dropshot rig. So, nice little finesse tactic here where you got your hook, your bait, everything's suspended right off the bottom. You kind of drag it around, cast it, drift in current, all sorts of stuff. It's really lifelike action. Your bait just kind of sits like this and shimmies along the bottom. It works well for largemouth, works well for smallmouth. So we'll go into everything that you need to know. We'll start with the rod. So this is a Dobbins 7-foot medium light. Any 7-foot medium light reel would work for a drop shot rig. Some people like a medium, some people like a medium light. It doesn't really matter all that much. Some people like a little bit faster tip, some people like a slower tip. So it's kind of up to you. I prefer to have a little bit of a slower tip, just the fast instead of an extra fast. I feel like it's a little more forgiving with the fish when they start jumping and stuff, especially with smallmouth. But usually a 7-foot medium light works really well, at least for the northern fish. Now, if you start getting around heavier cover, brush piles, docks, things of that nature at Lake the Ozarks or Table Rock or anywhere else in the Midwest or in the South, then I would upgrade to just like a 7-foot medium heavy. That's going to give you just a little bit more power and help you horse some fish around a little bit compared to like up here in the north where you're just mostly fishing open water. And you're going to want to use a spinning reel. You could use a bait cast, but I feel like that's just not as effective. I feel like with the casting it and just the nature of the drop shot, I usually use a size 2500. That's kind of the medium of a 3000, where you get a lot of casting distance but they're a lot bulkier, or the smaller 2000 where you don't get as much casting distance and they're too small. 2500 is a sweet spot. So take whatever preference you want for that. And I'm usually pairing it with braid. So this is 15-pound braid, and then I run a fluorocarbon leader up here. Fishing for smallies, I'm running 8-pound usually, or Table Rock I'm running 8-pound. If I'm at Lake the Ozarks or another body of water that's less clear, 12 to 14 usually get you done. All right, let's talk about hooks here. Pretty much my tried and true is gonna be either a 1/0 drop shot hook. This is a Gamakatsu, just a regular drop shot hook. They're hard to beat, they're sharp. You don't lose the fish. Or you can get one that's just a little bit smaller like this. I believe this is a size 1 maybe. So it's a little bit smaller, but it still has enough throat. But I prefer a 1/0 just because you start hooking baits on there, you want to have a little bit of the gap on there. Like up here, we do a lot of nose hooking because there's not much cover. There's not a lot to get stuck on, just rocks. So you're gonna kind of hook it like that on the nose, and your bait's just gonna drift like this through the current, or you can hop it around out on the lake, Lake Ontario, where there's no current, and just does its thing. It's really natural. But like at home, Lake the Ozarks or other lakes in the area where you're fishing cover, you can fish it weedless. So here's just like a little shaky head worm basically that I put on a drop shot hook. And here is a pretty cool little hook that works very, very well. Now you can use this for regular nose hooking, or you can use it for like a Texas rig. And this is just a Nico hook. It's a VMC makes it. It's a Nico hook. It's like just a little straight shank light wire hook. And you can get all different sizes. This is, I think, a size 1. At home, I would probably use a little bit bigger one because you're mostly fishing for largemouth and you're going to use worms most of the time, and it's going to be a little bit bulkier, and you want the good hook gap in the throat so you don't lose fish. But as far as rigging it weedless, say you're fishing around brush piles or something, it's the same thing. It's just a Texas rig. So you just poke it through just a little bit, get it started, and then hook it back through the worm. Leave yourself enough that it'll kind of poke through. And then you got a little weedless worm that you can work around brush piles and other stuff. As far as your weights go, my rule of thumb is usually use the lightest weight you can get away with. So like up here, fishing a river with a lot of current, usually using like 3/8 would be about the smallest if you're in the current. A lot of times 1/2 ounce, so you can still feel the bottom. But at Lake the Ozarks or just other lakes without so much current, a 3/8 would be a good starting point. Even dropping down to maybe like a 3/16 or a quarter wouldn't be a bad idea. But it ultimately depends kind of how deep you're fishing and how much bottom you want to feel. If you're fishing the ledges 20, 25 feet, then a 3/8 would be a really good starting spot, so you can constantly feel the whole time. If you're fishing shallower around boat docks or something, or brush piles, 10, 12 feet, well then like a 1/4 ounce would be good. And as far as the weights go, You kind of have two different styles. Well, you have shapes, but you also have connection styles. So here's kind of two different connections. You have just a regular loop that you tie into. There's nothing wrong with these, they work. Or I have these, which I really prefer, which is just a quick connect. So you actually just stick your line through this loop, pull it tight, and it holds it, and it won't fall off. And the benefit to that is if you do get snagged with the quick connect weight, you can just kind of pop your line, and it usually cuts it. And then you don't have to retie your entire rig. They also do make weights, better cylinders like this. I don't really see much benefit to it. I pretty much just use a teardrop style all the time, or a round one. The other ones, I don't think it really matters. Some people say it helps not get stuck so much on rocks, but don't really have much of an issue getting the drop shot weight stuck too much. As far as baits go, around home in the Ozark region, mostly just gonna use some sort of worm, either like this little finesse worm, or you could use like a larger trick worm. Shad shaped worms too, like a Gary Yamamoto, work well. You can drop shot like a Kitech or something if you want, but I normally don't do that. I normally just mostly stick with the worms around home. As far as up north, pretty much worms or goby imitation baits. Up here is what we're using a lot, which is like Berkeley flatworms, or this is like a little X Zone, or like a Gajo, Spirit Shad. These are just all little goby imitation baits, just little soft plastics. So that's all you need. You don't have to get real fancy with it, crazy with it. You know, it's most of the things that you have. You might just have to get a small, a light wire hook, something like a Nico hook that you can rig a bigger worm on and be weedless with it if you're fishing around brush piles or something. Okay, so the first thing I'm gonna do is tie my leader up. I'll take my leader line, this is my 8-pound line here, my fluorocarbon, and I'm gonna make a loop. And then I'm gonna take my braid and run through it. And I tie a modified Albright knot. I usually use like 15-pound braid, because if you start to go to the really small braid, it slips really bad because the diameter gets so small. So 15-pound braid's pretty good. So I run through and kind of pinch it all together, and you leave just a little bit of a tag. And then I'm gonna wrap this around both lines about 6 times. All right, then I'm gonna get it wrapped, and I'm gonna pinch it with the other finger, and then I'm gonna loop back the other direction same amount of times, and then go through the hole here the same direction. So I go 1, 2, 3, one more wrap here. All right, so you get it wrapped back, goes through the hole in the same direction. Then I grab both my tags on my braid and both on my fluorocarbon, and I slowly start to kind of pull it together to get it formed. And then before I get any real tension or pressure on it, then I wet it and I start pulling it together. And you kind of gotta get your ends pulled, and then grab your tag end and very lightly kind of work them down to get it cinched all the way down. And I grab both main lines, give it a nice pull, and it'll be seated. Trim your tails on your knot. As far as your fluorocarbon goes, you want to trim it pretty short because it's kind of stiff and it'll stick out and get stuck on your guides. Your braid, it's a little more manageable. I still try and trim it pretty short though. When it's all said and done, that is my connection knot right there. I don't know how well you can see on the GoPro. They usually don't focus that well when it's close up, but you see it's streamlined. It goes through your guides well. It goes through your reel really well. So from there, I usually reel up and try and get it to where my knot is either just in the spool or close to the spool when I'm reeled up. There's the knot, so I might cut it up here. All right, now we will actually go over setting up the drop shot rig. So you have a few different options on what knot you want to use. You can use a uni knot, you can use a Palomar knot, you can use pretty much whatever knot you regularly tie. There's just one thing you'll have to do at the end. In this example here, I'll just tie a Palomar knot. That's kind of one of the most, I guess, famous ones or ones that people use a lot when they do this. So the biggest thing you want is when your rig is all said and done, you want your hook like this. You don't want to tie it to where your hook's upside down. You won't get any good hook sets. You want your hook to be sitting like that when it's all rigged up. So the biggest thing you need to do is whatever knot you tie, put your hook like this, how it's going to be oriented, and then start your knot down through it like that. So if you're going to tie, make sure it's like this, and then tie your knot, and you'll be golden, and it'll be one final step. All right, so tie my Palomar knot here. Okay, get everything lined up, wet it down. Okay, got the Palomar knot tied. Now, here is your biggest step, no matter what knot you tie. Tie your knot, take your tag end, and pass it down through the loop in your eye. So it is pulling your weight down. Then you take your knot, whatever you got, and you can kind of position it a little bit. And that's that. Got your fancy little quick drop weight. So here's your whole little rig. Your hook down to your weight. This distance here from your weight to your hook is something that you will have to experiment with and decide how long you want it to be. Up here, so far, fishing for smallmouth, we haven't really had it any longer than about a foot. That's for this time of the year though. If you come in later, when the fish are a lot deeper out on humps and stuff, you might run a foot, foot and a half, something like that with a leader. Generally, I would say a good starting point is around a foot, but you know, it does not hurt to do a little bit more than that or a little bit less. It just kind of depends. Let's figure out, you know, what works for you or what's working on that given day. So as far as retrieving your drop shot, if you're in like a river, you just can kind of do drifts with it, cast it out, let the current take it down. That's what we do a lot up here for smallmouth, but for largemouth, you know, you don't have the current usually. You're just fishing around structure, you're fishing points or brush piles, docks, whatever. Flip it in areas and just kind of let it sit a little bit and then kind of work it back almost like a jig. Just let your weight always maintain bottom contact and just kind of work it along and just let it sit a little bit. If you get it near brush piles or something, just toss it by it, kind of shake it, wiggle it, let it sit. Sometimes less is more. It doesn't need a lot of action on your rod tip to get the bait moving. You don't have to sit there and wiggle it like crazy. You can just kind of hold it, and usually the waves or just the boat moving a little bit is enough to kind of impart a little bit of action into your bait. So it's definitely something you can use whenever fishing gets a little tough later in the summer, such as now when it starts getting a little hotter and, you know, people have been beating up the main lake points and stuff. The drop shot can come through and clean up a little bit on some of those areas and get some of those pressured fish. It's something that they just don't see as much. It's not directly on the bottom. It's kind of suspended right over top of them. I feel like they just can't take it. They can't not eat it after it's just sitting there right in their face. They just eventually just eat it. So it's a good technique. It's overlooked, I think, in the Midwest, especially is in some of the, you know, the dirtier lakes, which Ozarks or things of that nature. So that's all there is really to the drop shot rig. Give it a try. It definitely catch you some fish, especially if you're struggling or having a rough time. You know, break out the drop shot rig and you will definitely put some fish in the boat. Hopefully that helps you, and you go out and catch some of these pressured fish later in the summer and maybe use a little technique that you haven't used before. If you ever come up north, somebody does smallmouth fishing or something up north, you'll definitely learn to love the drop shot rig because it is very hard to beat up here in these northern waters.